Hello, everybody, on your May 1st. Welcome back to Ohio Has Issues. I'm Stephanie Haney.
I'm Mike Polk Jr. We did our 420 episode last week talking about weed legalization here in Ohio, and we had reggae music, and we were just talking about how we kind of miss the reggae music.
Yeah, doesn't quite hit the same.
It sets
that
a
little
vibe,
reggae.
doesn't it? But it also might be too loose of a vibe for today because we have a very specific Ohio Has Issues episode for you. In case you've never joined us before, we are the go-to place for secondhand information about Ohio politics. We bring you the best work of other people and tell you what's going on. Nice little summary of what's going on in Ohio politics this week. And we're actually going to be focusing in pretty hard on one particular issue this week, in addition to our other stuff that we normally do. But we're going to lock down on this. Last week, we learned that FirstEnergy gave $2.5 million to a nonprofit group that supported Mike DeWine in his campaign for governor in 2018. They also gave $1 million to another organization that supported Lieutenant Governor John Husted. He's now Lieutenant Governor John Husted. They recently revealed payments came from a 2022 deposition of a FirstEnergy executive testifying in a lawsuit brought by shareholders, which all connects back to that pesky House Bill 6 scandal that we're all very familiar with. Dark money isn't new. Ohio politics didn't invent it, although it does seem like we're trying to perfect it sometimes. And both the governor and the lieutenant governor are adamant about the fact that there is nothing nefarious about this, and perhaps that's the case. But based on the many established facts, the timeline of the donations, and the natural suspicion that is just going to justifiably exist moving forward regarding everything in relation to FirstEnergy, it's quite natural that the revelation of these new donations has provoked some conversation and some questioning. FirstEnergy, in case you have forgotten, has admitted to paying more than $60 million in bribes to people, including our former Ohio House Speaker, who is now serving 20 years in prison for his involvement. And when you do that, you pretty much give up your right to say, give us the benefit of the doubt. And so today we've decided to take a deeper look at this by talking to a bunch of very smart people who are in the know on the subject, including one of the journalists at the forefront of our story. We've got a bunch of experts and people who know about this topic that we're going to be bringing to you today, and maybe we'll all be smarter in the process. Stephanie, who is with us as our special guest?
I think that we'll definitely all be smarter in the process, for sure. You know, it's our job to ask questions of our leaders, and we're talking about today the top political leaders in the state of Ohio. So Governor Mike DeWine, Lieutenant John Husted, and Senate President Matt Huffman specifically mentioned. We'll be referencing them throughout. Did reach out to all of them. Only Governor Mike DeWine's office got back to us on this issue, which we'll get to in a moment. But our guests are Cleveland.com political reporter Jake Zuckerman. We also speak with University of Cincinnati political science professor David Niven. And then we talk with Common Cause Ohio Executive Director Catherine Turcer. And if you're not familiar with Common Cause Ohio, this is a watchdog organization. It's nonpartisan, it's nonprofit, and their goal is to bring information about what's happening in Ohio politics to people and to get people engaged.
And boy, they do not like dark money.
They do not.
To be fair.
That is for sure true about that. But before we get into all of that today, of course, we have some things that we do for you every week, and we've been giving you a rundown about what's going on in the Ohio legislature. This week, we have a special guest to handle this for us from the Ohio Capitol Journal. We have reporter Megan Henry. So she gives us the rundown on what's going on with two anti-LGBTQ plus bills, and then also what's happening with the marital rape prosecution exemption here in the state of Ohio. So let's take a look at that. All right, we've got Megan Henry here with us now. She's going to give us kind of the roundup of what's going on in the Ohio legislature. Megan, obviously with the Ohio Capitol Journal, boots on the ground. Fill us in, Megan. What's the latest and greatest happening in the legislature this week?
Hi, yes, thanks so much for having me. So there have been some anti-transgender bills that have been moving through the State House recently. Now, both of these bills, they're separate, introduced by different lawmakers, but they would both affect transgender and LGBTQ students in schools, in K through 12 schools. So there's House Bill 8, which is the Parental Bill of Rights that would basically educators would out students to parents under this bill, and parents would have the chance to review sexuality content material that is discussed and have the option to have alternative instructions instead. Now, this bill passed out of the House last summer and has recently seen movement over in the Senate and will likely be voted out of committee here soon. The Senate is not meeting this week in committee, but I expect it to be voted out soon. And then also there is House Bill 183, which is better known as the bathroom bill that would basically ban transgender students from using the bathroom that matches up with their gender identity. And so that bill was recently passed out of the House Higher Education Committee. It will not be on the floor next week in the House per Speaker Stevens, but it could be anytime soon on the House floor. If it's not this week or not next week, then it could be the weeks after.
Okay. Now that first bill that you mentioned, the Parental Bill of Rights that should be coming out of committee in the Senate, have you gotten any kind of a sense of what's expected once it hits the floor in the Senate? Do you expect that'll pass the Senate? Do you have any idea about that?
I do expect it to pass out of the Senate since it is Republican dominated, and it passed pretty much with ease, it seems, in the House, if I remember correctly. So I do expect the Senate to pass it. Now, it would have to go back to the House. There have been some changes that have been made to the bill since being in the Senate, so it would still have some logistical things if it were to go to the governor's desk, but I would expect it to pass out of the Senate.
Okay, a lot of questions there. That sounds like that's ripe for a future episode of Ohio Has Issues. Of course, considerations you're looking at there is what kind of a review is going to be available for these parents? What's that input process going to be like if they are indeed commenting and recommending things in terms of sexuality content? So that's definitely, I think, something we'll be seeing on a future episode of Ohio Has Issues. So thank you for that. That's very helpful information. Again, so those two bills, what were those bills numbers so we can keep a track on them?
Yes, it is House Bill 8 is the Parental Bill of Rights, and House Bill 183 is the Bathroom Bill.
Okay, so that is what our legislature is doing. And then a major update this week as well. What can you tell me, Megan, about House Bill 161? This is the related to marital sexual assault.
Yes, so it finally passed out of the legislature. It has yet to go to DeWine's desk for his signature, but that is expected to go to him to sign. But after many iterations of this going through various legislators, it is finally passed, and that eliminates exemptions for marital couples who previously were protected. Basically, the charges typically targeted in this bill are rape, sexual battery, unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, and sexual imposition. So big changes with that bill.
Yeah, it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the tenets of this, as it previously was with this exemption for being prosecuted for marital rape in Ohio, it was about where you lived, whether you lived together or not. That's something that's going away. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct under this bill.
All right, so we'll just kind of wait and see. Do we have any kind of indication of when Governor DeWine might sign that, or are we just kind of waiting to see when he makes time in his schedule?
Yeah, just kind of waiting to see the time in the schedule. I, of course, get his email updates on my phone. So every time I see an update on my email, I immediately like, oh, is this it? But has not happened yet, but stay tuned for that.
Wild to think that Ohio, up until this moment, one of 11 states that still had a marital sexual assault exemption on the books.
Yes, it is.
All right, Megan, thank you so much. We appreciate you again. Boots on the ground in Columbus, in our state capital, kind of giving us the lay of the land of what's going on in the legislature. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that was Megan Henry again from the Ohio Capitol Journal. Great resource. She is someone who is literally in the legislature on a weekly basis. So very happy to have her be aboard the Ohio Has Issues team.
Solid source. Thank you. That was great. Now we've got to get to your Senate update. We're doing this for you all the way up till November. Anything that happened, or in some cases didn't happen, that was a big deal in the Senate race this week between Moreno and Sherrod Brown. And there they are, guys. So what's going on, particularly about this FTC non-compete ban? I know that there was some action on that, Stephanie.
Yes. So this is a very interesting scenario for a lot of people. This will potentially impact a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So there's a regulation that's been put forth by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. This regulation will get rid of non-competes in the state of Ohio. Of course, it's going to be challenged legally, but we did learn today, I reached out to the FTC and found out that this new regulation, which would get rid of non-competes for most people.
No, non-compete, just so people know, I'm sorry. Pretend I'm super ignorant.
You're right, actually, thank you very much. So a non-compete agreement is something you have in a contract, and when you get hired by someone, a non-compete prevents you from working in the same industry in a certain parameter in a certain geographical area for a certain amount of time after you leave that company.
And that was recently overturned, or?
So the FTC has been talking about making a regulation that would ban non-competes in the United States.
And they've reacted to this.
Yeah, so they've done this. They have published a regulation, or they have come up with a regulation, and it will be published in the Federal Register on May 7th. That's what I learned today from someone with the FTC. They told me this via email today because I had reached out to them when we learned that they had decided to move forward with this regulation. Finally got the response today. Now, it will be in effect 120 days from May 7th. So that means this will go into effect September 4th. So as things stand right now, that means current non-competes that are in contracts will no longer be affected as of September 4th. However, this will be challenged.
Okay.
So we don't know exactly when it will take effect. There's also some conversation about if it's challenged in courts, this could push into the next administration. Of course, we have a presidential election coming up in November, so that could be a factor in terms of what happens to this eventually. But as of right now, this will go into effect September 4th. For a lot of people, non-competes will go away.
And what did Senator Sherrod Brown have to say about this?
Senator Sherrod Brown posted about this when we learned that it was coming out. And here's a quote from him. Corporations use non-compete agreements to prevent workers from leaving for jobs with better pay and benefits. They're exploitative, and I've been pushing for the FTC to ban them for years. Today is a great day for worker freedom. So that was tweeted by Senator Brown when we learned that this regulation would be moving forward with the FTC.
He didn't call us or anything, but we just saw that he said that.
I wish he would.
Now, have we heard from the candidate, Bernie Moreno, on this?
I did reach out to his team, and they did not respond to me. So can't give you any information on what Moreno's feelings or thoughts are on this.
Okay. What else is going on with the Senate candidates this week?
Well, tomorrow is a pretty big anniversary. Tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of when the Dobbs decision from the United States Supreme Court got leaked. So to remind you what that is, the Dobbs decision is what overruled Roe versus Wade, and it did away with federal guaranteed protection for abortion access.
Okay. And this was not, though, the actual day, the anniversary of it getting overturned. This is the time it got leaked from the Supreme Court where we found out that it was about to be overturned eventually.
Right. So it wasn't May 2nd when this happened. It wasn't May 2nd, 2022. It was actually later in June 2022. But it got leaked, which was a huge thing, obviously, a huge
So essentially, it's when we found out it was going to be overturned.
Right. So we have comments related to abortion access, of course, from both of the people who are running for the United States Senate. This is from Bernie Moreno on the Dobbs decision.
And he said 1 year ago today, the Supreme Court reversed a terrible decision made over 50 years ago that led to the unending of millions of unborn lives. Today, let's celebrate that monumental victory for the cause of life and commit to always fighting for the most vulnerable.
Now, again, he posted that on June 23rd, 2023, the 1-year anniversary of Dobbs ruling coming down and actually the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And we can tell you why that's relevant is because we know that Moreno has said he would vote for a national abortion ban of 15 weeks with what he calls common sense exceptions. So that's what we know about where he stands on abortion. Reminder, here in Ohio, we did enshrine abortion access into our Constitution in November. Now let's go to what Senator Sherrod Brown has said about this.
He said, I have always been clear about where I stand. I support abortion access for all women.
All right, and that is our Senate candidate update for you for this week.
Good update. Nice job. Now on to the main topic. We're talking about dark money, folks. And who better to talk to than one of the authors of some of the best writing about this. He's done some great investigative journalism. This guy's been a political reporter for Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer for quite some time now. I'm a big fan of his, and I'm glad that we finally got him on the show. This is Jake Zuckerman, folks. Enjoy the interview. Well, folks, we got ourselves a big fish here. This is Jake Zuckerman. He has been a political reporter. He's been covering Ohio politics for the Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com since 2020. We've been very reliant upon his coverage, and he's done really good work, including with the House Bill 6 issue, which has been described as one of the largest bribery scandals in Ohio history. Well, first of all, I should say welcome. Hi, Jake. Welcome.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
That was me being a human being. I'm still learning.
We're all learning.
So you have some new reporting on the House Bill 6, relatively new over the last couple of weeks. This has to do with the political donations through 501c groups, aka dark money super PACs. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it and why we are just learning about this now when the House Bill 6 scandal is quite old at this point?
Sure. So, with Larry Householder is now in prison, the former Speaker of the House of Ohio, and he went through a 2-month criminal trial with some COVID breaks in there. And in that trial, we just got this unprecedented amount of detail over how this money was getting from FirstEnergy Corp to this nonprofit controlled by Larry Householder. Like you mentioned, they went through groups called 501c4s. These are tax exempt groups. Technically, they're supposed to be social welfare org entities. They're supposed to improve the world around us. And many of them do, but a lot of them in politics are really just conduits to accept donations unlimited in size from donors unknown. They do not have to disclose their donors. Now, they cannot be controlled by politicians, but as we learned from Larry Householder's trial, in at least that one instance, one politician, Larry Householder, was very much in control of $60 million from FirstEnergy. That money went to his political benefit. It went to his personal benefit. It paid down his credit card debts. It improved his home. It paid off his legal bills. But so, for the longest time, this was understood as a Larry Householder scandal. He was the guy. And some shareholders of FirstEnergy, or I should say some investors of the company, have sued the company. And they basically say, look, we invested in you, and now you have embarrassed yourselves, and that has ruined the value of our investment. So we want, we believe we are entitled to some money here. And in the course of that litigation, there has been a huge amount of documents traded hands, and some of those have just now gotten released to the public, and they show that FirstEnergy, beyond just funding Larry Householder, they gave millions of dollars to Mike DeWine. They gave $1 million to Lieutenant Governor John Husted, all through 501c4s. They gave $300,000 to, I shouldn't say they gave them to these politicians. They gave them to 501c4s that they affiliated with these politicians. They gave $300,000 to what they called the Huffman C4, which is presumably a reference to Senate President Matt Huffman. So depending how you look at it, you could say, well, maybe Larry Householder went to jail for what everyone is doing and he doesn't belong in jail. Or you could look at it and say, well, they all got money too. They all voted for this bill. Maybe they belong in jail with Larry. So I think it just adds this new dimension of this kind of potent question of what exactly was Larry Householder doing that Mike DeWine, John Husted, and Matt Huffman were not.
So you mentioned those three, and in your reporting, you talk about each of the three of those. Why don't we go through each of them individually and talk about where that donation came from and how they've responded?
I wouldn't get too focused on any one of these 501c4s. It's a little more helpful to look at the big picture. FirstEnergy put millions of dollars into groups called, let's see, there was State Solutions. There was the Republican Governors Association, which is not a 501c4. They do have to disclose their donations, but importantly, not until after the election. So I'd call that quasi-dark money. It gave to another group called Securing Ohio's Future.
All these they all have, or not, whatever they are, they have great names.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can just pull any number of adjectives and random, good sounding nouns out of a bag and name a 501c4. They're not meant, most of these groups, they don't have a website. They don't have someone you can call. A lot of them are just registered out of Delaware, where the laws are very opaque for corporate entities. Usually they're incorporated by lawyers or accountants who aren't going to answer any reporters or members of the public. They really just exist for the purpose of secret donations. And FirstEnergy in total funded more than $4 million to both Lieutenant Governor Mike DeWine and John Husted. I'd say $1 million came to a group called Freedom Frontier. And again, there's no explicit association with John Husted, except in FirstEnergy's internal notes, they referred to it as the Husted C4. In some of the donations to Mike DeWine, there are internal notes from FirstEnergy saying this is for the DeWine campaign. So if you ask John Husted or Mike DeWine, they'll say, look, I didn't know about these donations. I didn't solicit them. I'm not affiliated with them. And that may well be true. We don't have access to these rooms where these conversations are happening. But we do know in one instance, there was a conversation. We know this from testimony at Larry Householder's trial and from some of these documents that Mike DeWine at a Republican Governors Association fundraiser went into a back room. I mean, it was literally a back room with FirstEnergy Solutions lobbyists, people who were very much in the thick of Larry Householder's criminal trial. They had a discussion that involved the nuclear bailouts that were the thing that FirstEnergy really wanted with all these donations. And then the next day, FirstEnergy cut a $500,000 check to the RGA, which was backing the governor's campaign. So again, there's a lot of money. If you just kind of follow it from point A to point B, point A being FirstEnergy, point B being somebody who is trying to support these candidates and spend a lot of money to get them into office. So, it's not right to say they're giving money directly to the governor, but while the governor might claim, I don't know what these groups are, I had nothing to do with them, FirstEnergy is very explicitly tying these groups to statewide politicians.
And the timeline would seem as though it would strain credulity to imagine that the governor was not aware of the fact that this was happening the day after that meeting. But his office has said that he had no knowledge of it. John Husted's office, though, had a different response. Didn't they? Are they just refusing to respond still and not say yes or no?
Well, so there's some different interesting answers. Lieutenant Governor Husted said, we didn't have any, I had no knowledge of this. I didn't know it happened. I didn't solicit this. Now, Governor Mike DeWine said on that meeting I just mentioned, he said, I don't remember the meeting, but I'm not disputing that it occurred. So interpret that how you will. I'll let people draw their own conclusions.
Now, how about Senate President Matt Huffman? How has he been connected to this money?
Sure. So there were some texts that came out in Larry Householder's trial that I would say kind of implicated Matt Huffman as operating a C4. There was a lobbyist who told undercover FBI agents that Matt Huffman has already set up a C4. There were some text messages between FirstEnergy's executives who were really orchestrating the scandal, saying that Matt Huffman has a C4, and they called him transactional, and they said he can get stuff done. They used a different word for stuff. And I asked Huffman through a spokesman about it at the time, and he said, these are, like, he's taken this position. This is how lobbyists brag and make themselves seem like big, tough guys. So yeah, I've got the Senate president on the line, and he's in my back pocket. But then these FirstEnergy documents came out, and they showed that they gave $300,000 to an entity called Liberty, Ohio, which, back to the grab bag names here. And they labeled that as the Huffman C4 in some internal emails. Now, again, Matt Huffman said, I had nothing to do with that. He, again, chalked this up to lobbyists, kind of bragging and puffing out their chests. He really disputed any association with the payment. But it really should be noted here that these are people, Matt Huffman played golf with some of these people, which is just another incredible detail. We learned, he literally had a tea time with the person who wrote the phrase, the Huffman C4. So again, I'll leave people to draw their own conclusions.
What string is going to be pulled on next? What are you guys looking for now that might help connect some of these dots a little better?
Well, I mean, I think the question I was hinting at earlier is really the big one here. Is what Larry Householder did substantially different. What Larry Householder did is he took a lot of money from FirstEnergy that was for his political gain and also his personal gain, which there's no allegation against any of these people that they used political money for personal use. So that's probably one important distinction. But even beyond that, Larry Householder wasn't just charged with the personal use of these funds. He was charged for his political gain. He used the money to help, build a political machine that got him into the speaker's office. In the same sense, Mike DeWine used this money to win the governor's office. He signed House Bill 6. He appointed Sam Randazzo. We haven't gotten into him, but he's a regulator who FirstEnergy admitted they bribed. The federal and state government charged him with taking a bribe. Mike DeWine he staffed his administration up with people with very close FirstEnergy ties. He took several official actions to the benefit of FirstEnergy. Now he says, look, I support nuclear energy in Ohio. I've always supported nuclear in Ohio. I didn't take a bribe. A company supported me because I have genuine political support for their interests. So I don't, what constitutes a bribe here is, I think, an interesting question. How explicit does a quid have to be to the quo? Could this be a case of FirstEnergy just supporting those who support their interests, or do these politicians support their interests because FirstEnergy supports their campaign?
It seems as though that ambiguity is actually benefiting everyone involved at this point, doesn't it?
I think so. And, there's a real risk here. If you're a prosecutor, you don't want to put yourself in a position of criminalizing ordinary political behavior.
Right.
Or if there's a change in power, it's not healthy in a political system to be constantly accusing governors of bribery, accusing top people of bribery. At a certain point, no one's going to trust their government. So perhaps there's just a problem in public policy and how we allow some of these contributions. Perhaps we need clear standards for what is a bribe, what is and what is not a bribe. I think there's some really thorny questions that especially these new revelations lay out, and another question that it's not so much a criminal justice question, but why do we have this system? Why have we allowed a company to spend so much more, like anywhere in the official process that this bill went is somebody who benefited to the tune of millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars from FirstEnergy. And we haven't even gotten into their standard, good old fashioned just contributions to a candidate.
It almost seems like Citizens United might not have been the democracy saver that we were all thinking it might have been at the time. But
I don't know who thought that one was saving democracy. But I'll say in Citizens United, if you read the part of the court's reasoning in that opinion, is that you have a free speech right to write these decisions. And also because these entities, these Liberty Ohio's and Generation Now's, are purportedly independent from candidates, there's no real corruption interest. How can you be paying off a politician if the politician's not involved? But at least in the case of Larry Householder, we know almost beyond, in fact, we do know beyond a reasonable doubt, he was involved. He was running the group. He was hiring. He was shaping its messaging. So of course there's an anti-corruption interest. A politician is running the entity. And the way FirstEnergy talked about these groups suggests that I wouldn't say they knew who was in control of them, but they knew who these organizations are for. They knew where they're putting their money, and they're in very close communication with some of the people who are benefiting.
It's a gross world. Thanks for helping us figure it all out, Jake Zuckerman. We appreciate it. Where can people find your work when they want to find you?
Cleveland.com. And if you're really one of those people, I'm on Twitter too.
All right. Thank you so much, Jake. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wasn't that great?
That was very insightful.
Jake
so
knows
much
his
detail
stuff.
from him.
Yep. Great reporting. Follow Jake. He knows his stuff, and he's been very helpful.
Absolutely. And I want to mention something about what he talked about there. He talked about the concept of what is a bribe and what's not a bribe. And that's an important distinction to make. It's something we're going to get into a little bit later with the executive director of Common Cause Ohio. But we do know that Larry Householder was convicted of accepting bribes. The 501c4 that was connected with him, Generation Now, it was said that he treated it as his personal piggy bank. $60 million got funneled into that, and he is sitting in federal prison right now. And here in Ohio, on May 13th, he's going to be arraigned on 22 felony state charges.
Okay, explain to me. So he's already in jail. He's already nailed. So what'll this do? What does this mean?
Well, the felony charges here in Ohio, if he is convicted of them, those charges would prevent him from running for office again here in Ohio. Currently, that's not the case with his federal conviction, but if he is convicted here in Ohio, that would be the case.
Oh man, that's tough news. Sorry, buddy. So we have to talk, though, about one of the sources of all of this, where this all started, dark money. And that started, well, it didn't start with, because dark money goes way back if you think about it historically. But really, it's really kicked in 2010 with that Citizens United decision. And maybe some people don't know about that, including me. Pretend I'm dumb. Tell me about it.
Okay, so Citizens United, which is something that you talked a lot about with Jake Zuckerman there, it was a Supreme Court decision in January of 2010. And so what this did was, it was very controversial, and it reversed some campaign finance controls that were in place here in the United States. So let's talk about what actually happened in that case, okay? A nonprofit group, a conservative nonprofit group called Citizens United, challenged campaign finance rules that were in place under the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And the FEC was stopping Citizens United from promoting and airing a film that criticized then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. They said it was too close to the presidential primaries. So it was a tight decision. It was a 5-4 decision in the United States Supreme Court. They sided with Citizens United, and it ruled that corporations and other entities can spend unlimited money on elections, which is important because there are limitations on personal donations to campaigns and
direct
things like that.
campaign donations, yes.
Right. So what's interesting here in Ohio is after this, our current Lieutenant Governor, John Husted, he was then a state senator, and he put forth some legislation in the state Senate that would have put some controls in place here in Ohio. Nothing totally, way out of the realm of what was kind of happening in terms of the ability to use dark money, but he put some controls in place, or wanted to. It passed the Senate, which was Republican controlled at the time. It didn't make it through the House here in Ohio, which was controlled by Democrats at the time. So there have been some attempts since then in our Ohio legislature, in the General Assembly. As recently as 2022, I think there was some legislation that was put forward, but it's not making it out of committee. Nothing's really coming from it. So Citizens United is the law of the land here in Ohio when it comes to campaign donations.
It's almost like the people who are ingrained within the system and benefit from Citizens United don't wish to fix it, maybe. But that's just speculation.
A lot of people benefiting from it, that's for sure.
Talking about people who have benefited from donations, generous donations at times, we are talking today, in case you missed, about the new revelations of donations that were made back in 2018 and 2017 to, amongst other people, Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted.
Groups that supported them.
Groups that supported, thank you. It was through FirstEnergy originally, through these groups, and then supported
of their campaigns.
Of their campaigns. I think we cleared that up. Now, all of them benefited from FirstEnergy money in the 501c4 organization, but who knew what when? What's the timeline? And are their claims that they have very little to do with this and very little memory of it even happening credible? I can't tell you that, but you know who can? Somebody who knows more about this. Like University of Cincinnati political science professor David Niven. He's a PhD that he got from Ohio State University. Go Buckeyes. He teaches American politics and conducts research on political campaigns at the University of Cincinnati. And I had a nice conversation with him. Take a look. Well, folks, you know what we're talking about today. We know that FirstEnergy made these donations totaling $1 million to 501c4 dark money groups supporting Lieutenant John Husted in 2018 and gave as much as $2.5 million in dark money groups supporting Governor Mike DeWine the same year. They are kind of downplaying their association with this and their knowledge of it, but I've got a gentleman here with me who disagrees from the University of Cincinnati. This is David Niven, and you aren't quite buying this.
I am not buying it, and there's several reasons I'm not buying it. First of all, people don't give large sums of money out of some good, impulse, some charitable notion that they just think it's a good thing to do. They give large sums of money for political influence. So it would be entirely counter to FirstEnergy's own efforts, their own interest in a return on investment, for there to be any uncertainty about the size and scope of their involvement. That's number one. Number two, campaigns study the money flow like it's the Talmud. They want to know everything. Money is how everything in a campaign works. You don't have money, you're not on TV. You don't have money, you can't pay for the polling. You don't have money, the whole operation grinds to a halt. So they are, going to be studying where this money's going. Even the money they don't directly control, they want to have a sense of how many ads are these groups going to be able to run. And here's the third thing that makes this go from implausible to just over the top impossible. One of the places they put their money was in the prosecutor's race for DeWine's daughter. This is a low profile, otherwise low money race. And they put hundreds of thousands of dollars backing DeWine's daughter for a race for prosecutor outside of Dayton. And if you want to tell me that Mike DeWine did not know who the biggest supporter of his daughter's campaign for prosecutor was, that's beyond I want to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, there is no Brooklyn Bridge you're trying to sell me.
To be fair, logically, he has supported energy his entire career. Why wouldn't the company that produces energy want to associate themselves and ingratiate themselves? I'm still not hearing anything illegal there. Now, it might be not believable that he doesn't know about it, but of course he would kind of know that they would be supporting him rather than someone who was anti-dirty energy.
Well, it's quite right to say that it's not illegal to give money. It's not illegal to do things for people. What's illegal is to do things for people so that they give you money. It's the relationship that turns this from, unseemly to illegal. So obviously we know, former Speaker Householder is in the federal penitentiary for crossing that line and doing things for money. Did Mike DeWine do things for money? No one has proven that, but goodness, this looks dirty. This looks terrible. This is not Mike DeWine, the cuddly Ohio grandpa who'll serve you a slice of pie. This is Mike DeWine running a cutthroat campaign with seven-figure sums flowing in and out that ultimately produces a billion-dollar boondoggle for this company. So, is there a direct line? No, we don't have some of the things they had on Speaker Householder, like wiretaps, where you could hear him directly talking about the money. And that's one of the reasons he's in prison. That may not exist for Mike DeWine, but let's keep in mind, the utility company wanted a specific person to be in charge of regulating utilities in Ohio. A specific person. They told Mike DeWine, put this person in charge. We know that. That's not in dispute. He put Sam Randazzo in charge. Randazzo had a history of taking bribes. And now, of course, Randazzo, as you well know, committed suicide. There's an awful lot about this story that Mike DeWine would not be comfortable talking about.
Can we get specifically to Lieutenant Husted,
Sure.
Governor Husted, just what he knew and why because we're talking a lot about Governor DeWine now. Does he have a more plausible case as far as not knowing about the $1 million donation
Right.
that was given to dark money groups that eventually went to support him?
John Husted has actually an even less plausible case, because let's think about the scope of his campaign. You know, he is running, relatively speaking, in 2018, 2017, as the less well-known candidate, the less established candidate. He's running with fewer connections than Mike DeWine. So the idea that the biggest flow of money into his campaign was something that was unknown to him is just absolute absurdity. I mean, that is the kind of stuff that keeps you in a race. That's the kind of stuff that lets you have a full-fledged campaign staff. And, you know, the rule of politics, I teach campaigns, and I always tell my students, it's not that having a funded campaign means that you're going to win. What it is if you have an ill-funded campaign, it means you're going to lose. So, you know, the difference here is, do I have a chance in this? And those kinds of massive donations mean, yes, I have a chance. I can have a full staff. I can have a full media, effort. Without that money, I'm basically an amateur running, and I'm not going to win. So, and keep in mind, for John Husted, this is, this was his big moment to rise up. He's a statewide office holder, but he's not the premier, best known statewide office holder. He doesn't have the stature that DeWine had, who'd been on the statewide scene for decades.
Do you see this having any long-term effects on them? We still haven't made any illegal connection. Is this just how this is going to be, and the people will just decide how it affects their opinion of these politicians?
Well, let's keep in mind a couple of things. First of all, Mike DeWine is pretty close to the end of the run here. So the ramifications for him, presumably never going to run for office again. He has literally 50 years worth of a public record. So he, I think, is just going to ride this out. He's going to aw shucks his way through this, unless there are wiretaps, unless there is, some evidence that we haven't seen that puts him with his hands directly, sort of leading the orchestra here. Otherwise, he may be the ultimate beneficiary of getting dirty with people who are dirtier than you are. So they're the first ones prosecuted, and in some cases, they're the ones who have taken themselves out. In the case of the two suicides. Now, for Husted, though, he has a future. He wants to be governor. He wants to keep running for things. And where it gets interesting is he could be running against, for example, Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, and the two of them could go back and forth over who failed in this situation and who had a responsibility to the public that they didn't meet. So unless there is a smoking gun document or recording, for DeWine, this is an unfortunate, probably first paragraph of the obituary story, but not one that stops the career. For John Husted, this could be the thing that stops you from getting where you wanted to be in the first place, because nobody grows up wanting to be lieutenant governor. And certainly John Husted didn't want to be lieutenant governor. He took this job to get to be in charge.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your insight. We appreciate it. I feel a little bit smarter about those two gentlemen, and I think everybody else does too. So appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure.
Bye now.
That was David Niven, everybody. That was insightful, wasn't it?
I appreciate his perspective, and it did kind of get me thinking about things in a different way.
Really, as somebody who does a lot of Zoom interviews and stuff about this stuff with people like that, scholars and whatnot, really well lit too, and he sounded great. Just your tech was on point, Dr. Niven, so thank you for your insight.
We do appreciate that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we did reach out. We've been talking about Ohio Governor Mike DeWine. We've been talking about Lieutenant Governor John Husted. We've been talking about Ohio State Senate President Matt Huffman. Reached out to all of them to get their perspective, see if they wanted to provide a statement for us here on Ohio Has Issues. Governor DeWine's office is the only office that got back to me. So I want to share with you the exact question that I asked his office. I said, We'd like to know how it's possible he didn't know about $2.5 million coming into State Solutions in 2018, with $500,000 of it denoted as DeWine. So we got the responses from his office here, so we're going to share that. Quite lengthy.
It is illegal for candidates to coordinate with 501c4 independent expenditure groups. So the answer to how it is possible is that the governor follows the law, and you are suggesting innuendo of illegal activity with no basis of facts.
Now, I would like to interject at this point that I do disagree about
I love
the
when you
innuendo.
interject, by the way. I've said this before, but go ahead, interject.
I love to interject, and I'm doing it right now, because I disagree that there was any innuendo in the question. I just asked, we'd like to know how it's possible he didn't know about $2.5 million coming into State Solutions in 2018, with $500,000 of it denoted as DeWine.
And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, based on the recent history with FirstEnergy, these aren't untoward questions. These aren't out of the realm of being logical to just say, and we're not saying, you did this. You're simply saying, we just want a response to this. And they do seem like they are a bit sensitive about it.
Well, more than sensitive. I will say that the press secretary, Dan Tierney, for Governor DeWine, told me that my question baselessly accuses public officials of illegal activity. I just also think this is a good point to remind everyone that our job is to question our leaders.
Just see what's going on, folks.
So let's continue on with some more from the quote from his office. Here's the next part.
I would point out that FirstEnergy operates in 7 states. Some of those states have Republican governors. Others have had recent Republican governors, and even more have had competitive gubernatorial elections recently as well. I point this out because the recent news articles and your question itself seems to assume that any donation to the Republican Governors Association, or a 501c4 independent expenditure group that supports Republican governors, could have only been made to support one particular governor.
Now, I think it's important to note here, if I may interject again, that $2.5 million was donated to that group from FirstEnergy, and $500,000 of it was specifically marked DeWine in the FirstEnergy internal documents. So there's no assumption happening here. $500,000 of it, at a minimum, was specifically donated for the benefit of Governor Mike DeWine, according to FirstEnergy records.
Okay.
Now, here's a little context for the next part of the response. Richard Cordray is the person that Governor DeWine beat in 2018 in the governor's race. So let's move on to the following quote.
It has been known for years that Governor DeWine supported nuclear energy in Ohio's nuclear plants going back to his tenure in the United States Senate, which of course predates House Bill 6. It was known in 2018, prior to House Bill 6, that Democrat nominee Richard Cordray also supported nuclear energy and keeping Ohio's nuclear plants open. It was known prior to these articles that FirstEnergy made donations in support of the governor, just as it made donations in support of Mr. Cordray. Now, Governor DeWine has said repeatedly that campaign donations do not influence his decisions and that he does not coordinate with independent expenditures as he follows the law.
So at this point, I would like to thank Governor DeWine's office for getting back to us.
Very kind.
All right, now, as we've said here multiple times, there's no evidence of breaking the law. We've said that here more than a few times. Legality is an interesting question on this. What's legal here in the state of Ohio? What's legal in the United States? So here's some information from Open Secrets. And Open Secrets is a nonpartisan group that tracks political spending.
Yes, and Open Secrets, by the way, they are just indicating how much this has been an influence and how much it has increasingly been an influence in Ohio politics over the years. Dark money groups and associated shell companies gave $40.1 million to federal candidates in the 2014 midterm elections. That's $40.1 in 2014. By the 2018 election, that had more than quadrupled to $180 million.
Wow.
In 2022, in the 2022 midterm, they spent $616 million, according to Open Secrets, a nonpartisan group that tracks political spending. So, as you can see, we can argue about whether it's bad, whether it's good, whether it's fair, whether it's legal, whether it's free speech, whether it's not. But we can't say that it's not an influence and that it's not increasing, that it must be having an effect on our politics.
Absolutely. So one group that kind of keeps an eye on these things is Common Cause Ohio. This is a group, here's what they say from their website to explain what Common Cause Ohio is. They work to strengthen public participation in our democracy, ensure that public officials and public institutions are accountable and responsive to citizens. They work with coalition building, lobbying and litigation, grassroots organizing, policy development, research, and public education. And their goal is to spotlight local, state, and national issues that affect every Ohioan. So they have a a pretty defined stance on dark money.
That's true. And who did you speak with?
Yeah, I spoke with the executive director of Common Cause Ohio, Catherine Turcer. So let's get her perspective on the state of affairs here in Ohio. All right, we are here with Catherine. Catherine, thank you so much for being with us here on Ohio Has Issues. We are talking about the story that just keeps on keeping on. We cannot seem to get it out of the headlines here in Ohio.
Well, and it's one of those stories that is complicated, but of course it's complicated because that was the intention. The intention was to hide all of the activities. And so, if folks get confused about what exactly happened, it's because it has taken years to untangle, and let's face it, an FBI investigation to untangle what happened during, 2018, 2019.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're very thankful for reporters like Andrew Tobias. He's a friend of our show. He's been on the show many times with Cleveland.com. You were quoted in a recent article of his, which was just kind of describing dark money, which is what we're talking about here today. The FirstEnergy bribery scandal, House Bill 6, what happened with former Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder and others. We are now coming to find here, they've been charged now at the state level. So one of the things you said in there was that people are acting like this just happened, but that Larry Householder was actually part of a corrupt system. So I want to ask you what you meant by that.
So I think what I meant by that is, do you know that old-fashioned phrase, pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in many ways, the House Bill 6 scheme was so big and so, so many layers and so much going on that, of course, it drew attention. It drew the attention of the FBI. It drew the attention of a ton of reporters. And yet, when push comes to shove, when we have this layer of secrecy, and so we're talking about, when we think about House Bill 6, we were talking about dark money in elections, dark money in lobbying, secret money surrounding a regulatory agency, so the Public Utilities Commission. So there were all of these different parts, and some of those parts had to do with Larry Householder, but some of them didn't. And I think it's really important, sometimes we like to think, okay, we got the bad guy, he's in prison. And clearly it's important that the former Speaker of the House is held accountable for what he did. But he's a character in the story. He is not the only villain here. And, when I look back and I think about, since his arrest in July of 2020, there have been plenty of opportunities to create a more transparent system, to make sure that we're not taken advantage of again. And elected officials, and we can say the state legislature, governor, etc., they have not taken action to create greater transparency and greater accountability. And so we have to expect that this is all just going to happen again.
That is an interesting point. We've gotten a lot of lip service about how horrible this was, that this happened. Not a lot of action, which is something I want to go into in a little bit more detail with you here in a little bit. But first, I'm going to ask you, you've been a longtime advocate for campaign finance reform. So when we're talking about this dark money that FirstEnergy was pumping in to these other organizations, it was campaign financing to a certain degree. It was money meant to influence campaigns, money meant to influence legislation. So I want to ask you, where did Ohio go wrong here that we got to this point where something like this is possible?
So I do think it's important to realize that Ohio is not the only state that faces these kinds of problems. I think where we went wrong is when we have had the opportunity to create greater transparency. And I think the best way to think about this is if you can follow the money, if you can ask questions about what's going on, we're better able to hold our elected officials accountable. We can ask questions about how policymakers are impacted by wealthy donors. We're able to better understand the thought that goes into policymaking. And at the end of the day, we want our elected officials to be accountable to us. And yet we have been operating in an era of secrecy. And so some of this came about because of a decision that was made by the US Supreme Court. This is the Citizens United decision, which said that corporations have the right to First Amendment. They have the right to speech. Specifically, they have the right to pay for political advertisements. Now, this isn't money that goes directly to the candidate. So like a lot of times when people are thinking about campaign finance, they're thinking about, oh, this is the money that goes to the candidate, or this is the money that goes to the political party. But really, at the end of the day, so much money is spent on these political advertisements. And that's where all of the secret money comes from. So, when Citizens United was decided in, it was January of 2010, I had envisioned like, okay, a corporation would pay for a political advertisement, and we would be up in arms about it, right? We would, oh, why are they doing this? Why did they spend $10 million? And yet we're in a system right now where it is constitutional to require better transparency. And yet the state of Ohio has not taken action. And for that matter, federally, it's not like the Federal Elections Commission has been changed. The rules surrounding national elections haven't changed either. And so we are left with a system that is secretive and fosters corruption, and we are living with the consequences. And so, when we think about House Bill 6, a lot of us think, oh, well, they repealed, the bailout for the nuclear plants, but they didn't repeal the bailout or the subsidies for the coal plants. And I think that's important too. This is the Ohio Valley Electric Corporation. Those plants, there are two of them. One's in Ohio, one's in Indiana. The primary beneficiary is American Electric Power, not even FirstEnergy. And we end up every single day, this is an estimate from the Ohio Consumer Council, we end up $533,000 a day that electricity ratepayers together pay. And since, House Bill 6 went into effect, that's $247 million. So you can put a price tag on the cost of corruption.
That is a lot of money. And there have been efforts in Ohio, but they've stalled. They haven't gone anywhere. There was actually a bill that was introduced here in Ohio. Husted, who was a state senator here in Ohio, current Lieutenant Governor John Husted, he introduced something that would have banned corporate contributions and new transparency rules. Passed in the Republican-controlled Ohio House at the time, actually stalled. The Republican-controlled Senate at the time stalled in the House, controlled by the Democrats. So it gets kind of to the question of, is this, we know former Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder was a Republican. We're going to talk shortly about how money was also given to current sitting Republican officials. But the person who brought these charges against former Ohio House Speaker Larry Householder, when those charges first came forward, again, obviously new charges have now come out, but it was U.S. Attorney David DeVillers. And he has since become a bit of an activist for campaign finance reform. He said, every Ohio politician seems to have their own 501c4 dark money organization. Does that feel like something that's true to you, being in the space that you've been working in and advocating for reform?
So it's incredibly sad. So when we say 501c4, what we're talking about are these nonprofits. And what is clear is that candidates should not be coordinating with nonprofits. That's clear. There are rules against that. But because we're operating in an environment of secret money, that means that, how can I put this? It's like anything, you're told not to do it, but no one's going to find out. So it's, it's the kind of thing, well, okay, this will make my campaign easier. No one will actually know. I think one of the things David DeVillers said that I thought was really meaningful, he said that the House Bill 6 scheme would not have been possible without dark money. And I think that is why he and many others have become advocates for greater transparency you know, we can look back and think about moments where we had an opportunity to create greater transparency, to address the challenges of corporate money in Ohio elections. And you mentioned, you know, the lieutenant governor who was, when he was in the Senate, working to pass, you know, greater transparency in elections, and that was effective. But of course, you know, politics gets in the way. You know, he was running to be the Ohio Secretary of State. And so the Democratic House didn't actually pass meaningful election because they didn't want to give John Husted a win. And so, you know, it's painful to think about like opportunities that like that being lost. But we have an opportunity now, and it's, you know, many years later, but we have an opportunity now. It is clear that there's a problem with secret money. And I really urge, you know, Democrats and Republicans to come together and to do the right thing.
Now, we mentioned it wasn't just Householder who received money from FirstEnergy and its subsidiaries through these dark money organizations. We now come to find out as more information becomes available. This is in Tobias's reporting as well. 6- and 7-figure checks were spent from FirstEnergy that were meant to gain influence. We know from documents that we've seen that they were sent through dark money organizations, and they were earmarked in the internal documentation to Governor Mike DeWine, Lieutenant Governor Don Husted, Ohio Senate President Matt Huffman. Now, when we look at what Larry Householder did, we know that with some of those funds, Larry Householder paid off personal credit cards. He fixed up a personal condo. So it kind of begs the question, because part of what he also did was put players in place who would support him by supporting their campaigns. What is a bribe? What is impermissible when we talk about this dark money issue? What rises to that actual level? So I want to ask you, from your perspective with Common Cause Ohio and as an advocate for financial reform and campaigns, is it just bribes that are a problem, or is it bigger than that? Is that the secrecy in general?
I worry a lot about the fact that we have created a system essentially of legalized bribery, right? This, like, everything is secret, right? Okay, so yes, you know, we can actually go to Secretary of State's office and look at look at their website, and we can actually identify money directly to candidates. But there's all of this other money looming around. So Open Secret said in 2022, $616 million was actually spent, secret money that we just couldn't figure out where it came from. So that's not Ohio, that's like all over the country. So what I would think we should all be thinking about is, if you create secrecy in elections and really no limitations on the activities of corporations, that not that they can give unlimited amounts, but just think about, you know, the difference between, I don't know, I could give $100 or maybe $500, you know, and the difference between that and what corporations can do. And that corporations often, and you can read this, like, as you're thinking about the public records and the court case that involved Larry Householder, they consider it an investment. That at the end, you know, that thing of like, okay, so they support this 501c4, this nonprofit or that nonprofit to support this candidate or that candidate, that what they're looking for is a really specific thing from government. And it's a way of saying, okay, if for example, this had all been successful and the FBI had never stepped in, you know, 60 million sounds like a lot until you start thinking about, what do they think, 1.3 billion that they thought that they would receive. So it, you know, what I worry about is the system of a whole. Yes, we need to hold bad actors accountable. We do need to be thinking about bribery, but we also need to be thinking about, well, how do we put guardrails in so that we have greater accountability, the ability to follow the money, and the ability to have conversations about who is trying to influence us. So when we think about some of the challenges of dark money, is they often lead to ads that are xenophobic or are ads that are just plain misinformation, where if we were actually able to understand who paid for the ad, well, then they would be much more open to being honest with the public, because we would be like, well, what the heck? Or you would question it. Okay, if FirstEnergy says this nuclear bailout is the best thing since sliced bread, you'd say, oh, well, because they want the bailout, which is why they would use, Generation Now or other nonprofits as their surrogates.
And that's an excellent point. Consider the source always, no matter where you're getting your information from. And when we don't have access to knowing what that source is, that puts us really kind of behind the 8 ball in these conversations. I want to highlight one thing that you mentioned earlier with that Citizens United Supreme Court ruling that sort of gave corporations, the free speech rights that individuals had, and said, they could do these things and this unlimited amount of money that can be funneled into politics. Just because that passed at the Supreme Court level, states can be tougher. They can. And there are states that are tougher. Arizona and Montana, for example, have laws that are tougher on the books when it comes to the transparency of campaign donations and contributions. So I want to ask you, my last question for you, Catherine, today is, what would you like to see happen here in Ohio as a result of the attention that's come to the FirstEnergy bribery scandal?
I would like greater transparency when it comes to money spent in Ohio elections. I would like greater transparency when it comes to lobbying. So it's important to think about the lobbying effort that went into House Bill 6. I would like greater transparency when it comes to the Public Utilities Commission. And I think it's important to think about, yes, we want greater transparency in our elections, and that will impact all sorts of different areas. But if we can actually follow the money in elections, understand the money that is going into lobbying and to influencing legislation, and be able to follow the money that surrounds regulatory agencies like the Public Utilities Commission, well, then we will be able to root out corruption and to create greater accountability and laws that work for all of us, not just the wealthy.
All right. Thank you very much for your expertise in this particular topic, Catherine. We appreciate you joining us here on Ohio Has Issues.
Well, thank you so much. And I just encourage everybody to get active and involved. Let's follow the money together.
Follow the money. That's what they're doing at Common Cause Ohio.
So, folks, that's all the information that we have right now about this recent development.
Yeah, obviously, we'll continue to share with you as we get more information. If we get new documents, this came from a FirstEnergy shareholders lawsuit, so that's where this deposition came from, as we were talking about with Jake Zuckerman. I will say this. What I thought was really interesting, and I really appreciated Catherine Turcer's perspective on this, the dark money, and just kind of wanting to shine light and be more transparent here in Ohio. I just think if you're going to say something, which the whole point of Citizens United is that these contributions are speech, they should be treated as speech, just own what you say.
The pushback is that they say that sometimes what you're saying might get you in some trouble or put you in a situation where you don't want to associate yourself with it. But I understand what you're saying, but that they're acting like they're at least suggesting that it's a protection of people who want to have that speech, but might not necessarily want their name on it for safety reasons or other reasons and whatnot. So that's the pushback, but I personally totally agree with you.
Yeah, it's a tricky place. There's not a lot of places where you can have speech and protect your identity, unless, of course, you're saying something on the internet under a fake username. That's possible.
It might be one of my Twitter burner accounts. You never know. I have several, and I'm coming at you folks all the time.
All right, I think that does it for our episode of Ohio Has Issues this week. A little note for you, we will not have a show next week, but we will be back May 15th.
It's not that politics aren't happening. It's just that every once in a while, you need a week off, and I don't know how to do this without her.
Yes, so we will be off, but we will be back. We will miss you terribly, but we will return May 15th, and we hope you'll be back with us then.
Stay vigilant, Ohio. Bye.